tonight we really have a lot of rich material, I think, to consider looking at Jesus the healer. And of course, we're continuing as we're moving through Matthew's gospel. We had considered last time this very important portrayal of Jesus as teacher, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount. And we remember that Matthew sort of, the way he structures this section of the gospel, rearranging Mark and introducing materials from Q, that he presents Jesus in this magnificent sort of dual panel of teacher and healer. And as we'll study in more detail next time, that all of this is instruction for the community, not only about the mission of Jesus, but about the mission of the community that is to follow that of Jesus. So we saw that the mission discourse comes after this large section, chapters 5 to 7, Jesus teacher, chapters 8 and 9, Jesus healer. And so tonight we're focusing on mainly these two chapters that Matthew has presented to us. It's very interesting, no matter how you approach it or which gospel text you might use, but certainly there's extraordinary consensus that Jesus of Nazareth was identified as a healer, and more healings are attributed to him than any figure from antiquity. There's never any question raised by his opponents in the gospel about the fact that he heals. They do raise the question, by whose power does he do it? But the fact of his healing is assumed and recognized. Jesus himself refers, at least indirectly, to himself as a physician, iatros, as a healer. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 12, the calling of Matthew, the tax collector, when his opponents object to him, he said, the righteous people do not need a physician, sick people do. I've come to call sinners and not the righteous, referring to himself. And you have the parallel in Mark chapter 2. And then you have in Luke the opening scene of his gospel in the synagogue of Nazareth, opening scene of the public ministry of Jesus, I should say. He says to the hometown congregation, "Doubtless you will say to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' Do here in Nazareth what we heard you did in Capharnaum." So not only the evidence of so many healing stories in the Gospels and the reputation of Jesus as healer, but also in his self-designation. One of the things over the years, for a lot of, tangential reasons, I've tried to read around a lot and think about this whole notion of illness and disability and healing. And I just put some points here that I'll go through rather quickly, but as a way of getting our thinking going about this very pervasive human experience and how the different dimensions of it that are revealed in the gospel stories. Many people make a distinction, sort of a quasi-technical distinction, between disease and illness. Disease understood as a biological, physical phenomenon. Illness reaches in beyond the physical to psychosomatic, spiritual, psychological impacts, that an illness may not terminate with a cure. Okay? You can cure a disease, but you have to heal an illness. People use this terminology if you read around in some of the literature. And that has to do with the second point here, that illness, when you think about it, illness or the impact of a severe disability and the process of healing are multi-level phenomena. And they are not static, okay? Two things, they're multi-level and they're not static. Multi-level, when we think about it, we're talking about fairly serious, although sometimes things that are not so serious can have a lot of impacts on us. You know, an ingrown toenail can start to cause existential anguish. But it's a physical reality. It's a psychological reality. It affects our mood, our spirit. It's a social reality. It can have an impact on our relationships, to our own body, to our family, to our workplace, to our community. And it's a spiritual reality. It reaches deep at times, raising questions about our own identity and our own destiny and our relationship to God. And the whole process, both of sickness and healing, people refer to it as a liminal experience. I think you know this term. It's like a term used in cultural anthropology in thinking about illnesses. It's from the Latin word, whoops, this is one of the duds. We'll retire that one. That one is ill. So it's from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. And people refer to illness as something like a journey, you know, so you have a world that you have known, you know, you've experienced a certain ease with your body, with your mind and spirit, and your relationships, your workplace, how that functions, but suddenly you have something happen to you that radically changes that. And you, in effect, are setting out on a journey. And where you're going to end up may not yet be sure. It could be rehabilitation, it could be healing, cure, it could be something more threatening and severe. It could be death itself. So in the meantime, the person is on a journey, and this is where it's called liminal, because you're between two worlds. You sort of go over a threshold and enter into a new world. People have compared this to those, and probably many of you here, who have gone to another country, another culture, another language, entered into that situation, lived there, and then return. And you're coming back to a world that you don't know. The Peace Corps people experienced this. They were between worlds. Okay? The Peace Corps spoke of a way where they would say, you know, your body leaves before your spirit, okay, and arrives later. But also when you're going somewhere, your spirit leaves before your body. Okay? You know, and you know, you can sense, it's true, you have to sort of collect, you know, who you've been as you come. These are all liminal experiences, and illness can be this way. And one of the things that happens is that people who are here in the world the person know don't realize that the person who's been very ill or addicted and gone through a process, they don't know they've been on this journey. Okay? And they deal with them as if they had never left. Okay? So if they were an addict before, that's the way they look at them. You know, if they just think of them as the same person they knew, but in fact, this person has gone to another world and might be returning, and they're different, okay? You'll have instances of this in the Gospels. These are sort of existential things. And then illness or sickness has symbolic dimensions. There's a famous essay written by Susan Sontag, the literary critic that was ultimately published as a small book she had written in the New Yorker. And she tracked the symbolic dimensions of some illnesses. Tuberculosis in the 19th century, it was like death itself. People didn't speak about it. Yet it was also romantic. I don't think you could be canonized unless you had tuberculosis at the end of the, all the saints had this. It was sort of like enduring death itself heroically. Or then she says the substitute for that, or the successor, was cancer, the big C. A lot of times people would not speak about it. They didn't put it on their death certificate. They wouldn't put it in the obituary. It was considered somehow shameful. And then, of course, her last example was AIDS. That AIDS, too, has this kind of connection with it that is shameful, threatening, mysterious, like death itself. And, of course, the connection here to the biblical leprosy, prime example, the first healing story that Matthew gives us. And if you read Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, you see all the symbolisms associated with leprosy, which was probably Hansen's disease, a skin disease, I mean not Hansen's disease, but some kind of virulent skin disease from the symptoms described in Leviticus. Something very visible, and anthropologists tell us that visible diseases, skin diseases, are highly tabooed in traditional cultures. It's something that the skin is seen even as sort of the boundary between the inside world and the outside world. And eruptions on the skin are seen as somehow like death making its appearance. I don't know if any of you have ever read Mary Douglas, the wonderful cultural anthropologist. Her book, Purity and Danger, is a wonderful book to read about this. And she has a chapter on the kosher foods and on the healing stories in the Bible. But she's studying traditional cultures and their ways of looking at illness. Then another thing just to think about, to throw all this into the stew, is that there's boundary questions with healing and with illness. This is certainly dramatized in leprosy, where the person is to avoid being in contact with the living. But isolation is a very common experience of people with serious illness. Even if they're not physically isolated, they become socially isolated, or they think of themselves as being isolated. And so the question of access, of being able to be part of the community, to have symbolic actions and gestures that enable a person to be part of the community. Touch, very important, the sacrament of touch people speak about, to contact, vital contact, embracing, all of these is establishing some kind of communion or communication, union with someone who feels excluded because of their conditions. And the Gospels are loaded with this, with notions of access. And then finally, this is something that a number of authors who have written on this say that, the miracle stories in the Gospel, the healing stories or the exorcism stories, are both revelation and mandate. Okay? So their revelation, they disclose God's way of dealing with things. They disclose Jesus' mission. They disclose the plight of the person who is sick. They reveal human interactions. Other people react in different ways. But also the process of healing someone. When Jesus heals, and Matthew certainly makes this explicit in the way he's ordering his gospel, that it's a mandate. This is what we are to do. And healing became, if not the major category, one of the major ways of language of speaking of ministry in the early church. The bishop was known as the hiatros, as the physician. So that it certainly was seen the community's work not only physically but in widening circles of the impact of this, that healing was important. I remember reading an article by Gary Anderson, who is teaching at Notre Dame currently, had been at Harvard, and he wrote a book, wrote an article in Commonweal a few months ago now. And he mentioned, if you were able to take an aerial photograph of Imperial Rome, say around the 3rd century, and then took another aerial photograph around the 7th or 8th century, you would see that the whole center of the architecture of the city had changed. It had moved from being monumental imperial structures and arcades and forums to hospices and healing centers and gatherings. It had changed the physical architecture because of Christianity coming in. The healing became such a significant outpouring of Christian work. And I think it all comes back to this root, not only because healing is so symbolic, if you like, or expressive of our mortal condition, but it is also so expressive of what salvation means, the transformation of our circumstances. So the gospel miracles as revelation and mandate, the whole notion of healing, both physically and the multi-dimensions we talked about. So this just a little, just start thinking about these stories. If we think of the gospel healing stories simply in a kind of apologetic mode, that they show Jesus' divine power. Well, they do show Jesus' extraordinary divine power to heal, but there's much more going on in these stories than simply some statement about the power of Jesus' extraordinary power. Let's turn to Matthew's view of things here, and we'll move through these first, especially the first part. The healing section of Matthew's Gospel, by the way, I give you that reference to H.J. Held in this famous book, Tradition and Interpretation in Matthew. It's a collection of articles. This was a whole group of German authors in the post-war period. This is really the beginning of redaction criticism, as it's called, to really study the Gospel of Matthew on its own terms, or the other Gospels. And one of the essays in there is by Hans Joachim Held, and was on this section of the Gospel we're talking about, chapters 8 and 9. And he, he compared this to Mark's Gospel and to the other sources we'll talk about in a moment, and tried to determine what was sort of the structure of this section we're talking about. Do I have them too close together maybe? See if I move it up. Can you hear that static? Does that do it better? Okay. Okay, so far so good. Thanks, Stephanie. So what he has done, if you look at your text, he says there's like 3 segments in here. And what's very important at the outset, Held himself said, these are not like rigorous sections, each with its own unique emphasis, and then that's over, and then you go to a second. It's more fluid. But these emphases seem to be sort of the dominant motif of each of these clusters of miracles. There are 10 miracles told here. The last one, as we'll see at the conclusion, is really, it's hardly a description at all, the healing. It's simply a trigger for differing reactions, the crowds and the opponents of Jesus, as we'll see. So there's like 3 groups of 3 that are very important. And the first, he said, is the power of Jesus to heal. And we'll see that, I think, is pretty clear. And Matthew has these 3 great stories. He ends with the fulfillment text that we had looked at earlier in chapter 8, verse 17. We'll look at this shortly. And then the second is healing and discipleship. And part of that comes from the fact that Matthew focuses here on the faith of the people, on their responsiveness to Jesus, the people who are involved. And he has also interjected into here some material from Mark about the would-be followers of Jesus. I'll follow you wherever you go, but first let me go and bury my father. Those texts, they're sort of stuck in here, and they give this emphasis. The healing stories reveal the allegiance of people to Jesus and their willingness to follow him, Matthew the tax collector, and so on. And then the final one he called praying faith. This is like entreaty. It's faith that leads to asking for healing. And one of the very interesting things in the healing stories, and this goes back also to the dynamics of healing, about, for example, the question of access, is that the sick here, or their friends, as in the case of the paralytic, are not passive. They are part of the healing process. They insert themselves. They place themselves before Jesus, or somebody brings them before him. And this is very important because part of the isolation of someone who is ill or has a disability is often they're encouraged to be passive, okay? And not to seek access, not to get in the way, not to be too visible. And this you see in the Gospels, the people, the woman with the hemorrhage, they insert themselves into the story, and Jesus responds by praising their faith. So the dominant motifs here as Held proposed. And then I put the sources. You can see here there's Q material, in other words, material common with Luke but not found in Mark. Chapter 8, verse 5 to 13, the healing of the centurion's pice, his servant, his boy. Then the would-be disciples that I mentioned earlier, that come forward in the second section. Except for that, everything is from Mark. But Matthew, what's very interesting, if you want to treat yourself to seeing sort of the consistency of the evangelists, compare these stories to Mark's account. Matthew, one of the things he does is he abbreviates the details. There's no cushion in the boat that Jesus is lying on. The paralytic's friends don't let him down through the roof. Okay. There's the story of the Gadarene demoniac. We missed the whole thing about living among the tombs and all of this. He's shortened. He's made these stories very pointed. And most interpreters of Matthew say that's because he's focusing on the action of Jesus, the intense action of Jesus, and the impact on the person who is ill. And a lot of the other details, some of them may have been even embarrassing to Matthew, but he really tightens these stories consistently in the healing stories of Matthew. There's a lot of editing here. It's definitely the Markan sequence, Markan stories, but Matthew has, trimmed this to make his powerful portrayal of Jesus the healer and these other underlying motifs. So let's look at them, okay? So starting with this first one, again, we're not able to go through verse by verse. You can do that with your commentary. But what we're trying to see is sort of the cogency of this. What's the overall impact of this portrayal of Jesus? And the first one truly focuses on Jesus' power. In Mark's gospel, in the first day of healing in Capharnaum, the healing of the leper comes last. Okay? And in Matthew's lineup, it comes first. Okay? So right off the bat, as he comes down from the mountain, we saw that In verse 28, when he finished all these things, the crowds were astounded at his teaching. He taught them as one having authority, not as their scribes. And he comes down the mountain, and here comes, Exhibit A, the leper. Okay? And it's interesting, one of the things that Matthew does in this gospel, but shifts it to something else, he doesn't use this very vivid verb that Mark uses. When Jesus catches sight of the leper, and the leper comes to him, comes forward and kneels in front of him. In Mark's text, there's this famous word, this verb, splagnitzomai. Splagna are your intestines, your guts. And it's in effect, that his guts were churned. His bowels were moved in the sense of deep stirring, because emotion in Semitic anthropology, the intestines are the seat of emotion. So Mark emphasizes, as he does in a number of places, like he also drops in the scene of the storm at sea that comes up here. He not only doesn't have Jesus laying on a cushion, but the disciples in Mark say, "Don't you care that we're drowning?" Well, Matthew edits that out. But here he takes that word out. You don't have this deep emotion. But what's interesting, he puts the word back in where at the end of chapter 9, Jesus sees the crowds and he says he was moved with pity. But it's the same verb, splagnitzomai, that he's stolen from Mark. In this deep, profound moving of Jesus with emotion when he sees the sheep without a shepherd at the very end of chapter 9, as we'll see, as he's about to send the disciples out. So here we have the cleansing of the leper. We have the story, we'll look at this from one point of view in chapter 9, chapter 8 rather, the centurion. He heals at a distance with a word. He doesn't even have to touch the person. And Matthew hones in on this story. And then he moves to Simon's mother-in-law. This is very similar in Mark. And he raises her up and enables her to diakonein, to serve, to the very key discipleship word in both Mark and Matthew. And then you have this summary. That evening they brought to him many who were possessed by demons. He cast out the spirits with a word and cured all who were sick. Okay. Healed them. And then we have that text. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took away, elaben, he lifted away our infirmities, a sense of liberation. And he carried our infirmities. So there's both a sense of liberation and of identification here. Whatever you do, the least you do to me. I'm thinking of this motif we'll come across in Matthew. So this is from Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4, the suffering servant. So Jesus is both a liberator and sufferer with people. This evening I saw the news, right? The very end of the news. I came in and they had a story about Syria. And did you happen to see that with the children? Yeah. And these children that had lost their father. It was a very touching scene. But the reporter just had to embrace these kids. Just nothing he could do. They had all lost their fathers, little kids. They all started crying as they thought about it. But I thought, well, that's, what else do you do at this point in it? It's embracing. He couldn't liberate much except through embracing them. So this first section, I think, is clearly, Matthew just hits us. Jesus wades into this sea of illness and suffering and heals and liberates and identifies with them. Now, the second segment that Held says involves discipleship motifs along with the healing starts in chapter 8, verse 18. And here is where he injects something from Q, not found in Mark's Gospel. This is found in Luke's Gospel in chapter 9, after verse 51, when Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem at the beginning of the journey. And he starts to go, and then these would-be disciples come to him. And Matthew has transposed that Q story into this setting. And, scribe, I will follow you wherever you go. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests. Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another of his disciples said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their dead. These are, very strong statements that Jesus checks sort of as something said, unconsidered discipleship. I will follow you wherever you go. Are you sure? And then a very sacred obligation, one of the most sacred obligations of piety in Judaism, the burial of the father. But that does not come first. This call to discipleship cuts across all familial responsibilities. We'll see this in chapter 12, who is the true family of Jesus. It's already in Mark's Gospel, this subordination of family ties to discipleship ties. It's not a negation of family obligations. It's not cruelty, but it's putting in stark terms the contrast. And many times in Christian experience, that's exactly what happens. People have to put discipleship responsibilities in before family responsibilities. And so here, and then you look in chapter 8, 23 and following, the notion here of little faith, the stilling of the storm. Again, this story is so truncated in Matthew. Verse 23, it's certainly a healing. It's a healing it's like an exorcism of the sea that we know is like demonic in the view of the Semitic peoples. And Lord, save us. Here's a new title for us, Kyrie. Lord, save us. We're sort of collecting titles in this whole section. There's tons of titles ascribed to Jesus. And this is a very important one, Kyrios. Save us, we are perishing. He said to them, why are you afraid, you of little faith? This is the first instance we've had here of a term that's very typical of Matthew. In Mark's text, he says, why do you have no faith? Okay. But Matthew changes it to little faith. Okay. They have faith, but it's weak. And it's often associated with the same thing. Why were you afraid? Fear and hesitation. The verb edidaste is used. That's, I think, how little faith is expressed by being overwhelmed by fear or hesitation. But they have faith. We'll see that. We'll take up the notion of discipleship and mission coming up next time. We'll see these are both very consistent in Matthew's editing of Mark. And then we have the call of Matthew here. Here's a discipleship story. And Jesus walking along, he sees a man called Matthew. It's Levi in Mark's text. Follow me. He gets up and follows him. It's like the call stories we saw. And we'll take up discipleship motifs. Excuse me for keep blowing my nose. I have it's a post-nasal drip or whatever it is. I'm sorry, I had some oral surgery, so that's what. But if it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me. So here, of course, the follow-up to this is so interesting. As he sat in dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners were sitting with him and his disciples. And people don't know the house here. Is this Matthew's house? Or is this Peter's mother-in-law's house? Is this Jesus' house? He doesn't clearly say. In Mark, he says, in his house. But again, it's ambiguous, referring to Levi or to Jesus or whatever. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." You remember we talked last week, and we talked earlier in talking about the fulfillment text. For Matthew, "I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them." So this action of eating with tax collectors and sinners, with unclean people, which might seem to be a violation of the law, Matthew shows no, this is fulfilling Hosea chapter 9, verse 9. In Jesus' own words, he's complying with the deeper demands of the law. So this is not violating the law, this is following the law that's ruled by the love command. So this motif that comes up here of the least and the outcast, this is also, it's placed in a context of healing. These are the healing chapters, and Jesus' association with people. This shows when he cites the term physician, nobody's been physically healed here, okay? Right? What's happened is somebody who is an outcast, a social pariah, someone who has been really violating people, is drawn in as a disciple, and that's a healing. Okay. That's a healing. And it's clear in the Gospels that they're well aware of the sort of dimensions of the healing process that go beyond the physical. This is very typical of most traditional medicine. I remember reading someone's studying about traditional medicines, and they said the first question that's asked is not what caused it, it's who caused it. It's the interpersonal dimension. Why is the person alienated that's leading them to this illness? And here, this is a healing of a who, of drawing him in, and you have the protest of the healthy community. If you knew who he was eating with, but Jesus is aware of the dignity and the transformation that can affect Matthew when he experiences mercy. And in a sense, I'll come back to this point, but this next section, next few verses, 14 to 17, here it's about timing. And this, many people have seen this as a kind of central affirmation in the midst of all of this. It's certainly very clear in Mark's text. This is from Mark. In chapter 2, 1 to 3, 6, it's what's called a chiasm. And it's right at the very heart of that section, the conflict stories that Mark presents, healing conflict stories. And it's to say, it's identifying Jesus. He is the bridegroom, and it's the time of the bridegroom. So it's revealing the power of Jesus to heal, the longing of Israel for deliverance, which was often put in terms of a wedding feast. The notion of putting new wine into new wineskins, radical transformation, the time of change. And this rules very strongly Matthew's whole perspective. As we'll be culling these as we go along, we come to the eschatological discourse. But as one person said, Matthew's gospel is in two levels of time. It's the then now and the present now. The then now is the story and the mission discourse and the healings. But there's a present now for the community, that they're living in a whole new age. And it's the roll-up to the end time. Excuse me. So this, seemingly dislocated section here about the banquet and about new wine and new wineskins. And notice also, I should finish my sentence, this is sort of the Christological affirmation, the salvation history affirmation that's giving sort of the framework for all that's happening here. Notice a little phrase that Matthew adds to this at the very end in verse 17. New wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. Okay. Remember this thing at the end of chapter 13, the scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven brings out of his treasure house things that are both old and new and old, as he says. This idea of conserving, of nothing being destroyed. I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. So the transformation, in a sense, saves the old and does not abandon it, but it brings it into a new moment. And then we have this section that Held called praying faith. This section. And you notice, for example, in 9:2, and here again, a very truncated story. We don't have all the great things about them coming and the doorway being jammed and going up on the roof and letting them down through the roof. That's Matthew drops all that. It's in Luke's story, but it's not here. And he says, he saw their faith. That is key. There's faith here, entreating faith, praying faith, as Held called it. Suppliant faith, others have said. And this very interesting story, it's the faith of the friends of the man that brings him here. It's the faith of his community that enables him to be healed, that gives him access to Jesus. People have noted this in all of the versions of this story. And here, his sins are forgiven. This, is a dip again into the, what would you say, the theological anthropology of the Gospels and I've done this with other settings, some of you may get bored with it, but, if you and on this side. I think this is really at work, that they have a kind of sorting out, that sickness is really a symptom of death. It's our mortality. Okay? And underneath that, the agent of death and mortality is Satan, the power of evil. And this doesn't mean the individual is an agent of evil or commits evil. This, we have to be very careful with this in trying to understand what their categories were. But they believed, dig deeply enough, that the power of death is underneath. To be ill is, and to have suffering, physical, mental, social, is a blight on what God intended for humanity, flourishing in every way. But death, the opening chapter of the Book of Wisdom, God created the world to be good. No destructive drug did he put therein, but humans made a pact with death and invited it in. That's, it's the Genesis story. And so this healing and forgiveness are very similar. Forgiveness noted here not from the sense of personal sins, but being liberated from the power of sin. And on this side, well-being, which we all desire, is rooted in life, Zoe, which has as its author God. It's one of the deepest convictions of the biblical faith, that God is the author of all life. So that's why you have to purify yourself from any contamination from death in order to enter into the zone of God. Like the temple, you purify yourself. Not from sin, not from failings, not from dirt. Mary Douglas says it's not about dirt. It's about death, the symptoms of death that you carry into the very presence of absolute life. And so you purify yourself from any contaminations of death. And so to Jesus, suffused with the Spirit of God, is a healer, and he has an abundance of life. And in the ancient world, it often, illness was described as asthenia, a lot of the words used in these stories. Weakness, lack of vital force. So the contact with Jesus is a transfer of vital force from the healer to the one needing to be healed. It's not a bad concept. When you think of conversation, counseling, physician, there's a source of vital force that is transmitted to the person who's bereft of it in this particular circumstance. And that was what the ancient world thought. And you have, it's not as clear in Matthew's version of the story, but the woman who wants just to touch him. And in Mark, he feels the power leak out of him, stream out of him. Literally, it's like liquid. Okay. And Matthew finds that maybe a little too much. He eliminates that little detail, but the woman touches Jesus and power goes out from him, and he's healed. So she has been ill for so long and bleeding, all the symptoms here. And she touches Jesus and she's healed. And she believed. What her act of faith was in the story is believing that she could be healed by touching him. So, it's a very, the same with the paralytic. The men, his friends, bring him to Jesus, convinced that if he's in vital contact with him, he will be healed, which is the case. And you also have here, of course, the story of the man, the leader of the synagogue, that also is, is healed. His daughter is healed, raised from the dead. He believes. Do you believe? Yes, I believe. You have that story there. While he was saying these things, this is verse 18, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. So, this is this suppliant faith, this praying faith that Held says is the one of the main motifs of this section. I think there are two other things in here that are worth noting that are sort of minor motifs, if you like, but I think very important for Matthew and important for our ongoing reading of the gospel. And that is the anticipation of the universal mission yet to come. And of course, we have that with the centurion in chapter 9, verse 5 to 15. And this is a text that is imported from Q. But it is, sorry, did I put 9? There should be, wait a minute, what am I doing here? It should be 8 on your notes. You see the mistake there? I was waiting to see if any of you could correct it. It's 8, 5 to 13. Under D there. Thank you, sorry. But, this is part of these first 3 healing stories and the emphasis on Jesus' power. At a distance, he heals with a word and doesn't have to go to the young boy. But also very important who this is a centurion at Capharnaum. And by the way, this says very similitude, both that and Matthew, the tax collector, because Capharnaum was a frontier town. It was a border town between the ethnarchy of Herod Philip and the ethnarchy of Herod Antipas in the time of Jesus. And archaeology has even confirmed that. So it's a centurion, a garrison there, makes sense as a matter of fact. But the point of the story, of course, is that he has this extraordinary faith. And Jesus says to him in verse 10, truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. And many will come from east and west and eat with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom be thrown into the outer darkness. And this text is evokes what's called the procession of the nations. And you find this in Isaiah. The nations will come, carrying gifts to Israel. It's sort of a sense of almost enslavement. They're bowed in defeat, and they come to offer homage to Israel. Here, what Matthew does is, in the saying of Jesus that he has, they come to Israel, but they eat at table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They're coming to share in the bounty of the kingdom. This is again the bridegroom, the banquet. So this is a very important. The centurion. We've had the Magi. We'll have later the Canaanite woman. We have the Gadarene coming up. These glimpses of what is to be. But the focus of Matthew is not yet there. It's just two hints that it's going to be there. This turning, as we'll see when we take up the mission question in Matthew in detail. And look at the Gadarene demoniac. This in chapter 8, 28 to 34. This last segment here. This, in Mark's Gospel, is chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. It's the longest exorcism story in the Gospels. And it's a magnificent example in Mark's context of what healing and salvation means. The man described in so much detail, self-destructive, wailing, living among the tombs, etc., etc. And he comes and Jesus drives out Legion. You remember that story? It's a powerful story. And then at the end of the story, the townspeople come out. They see the man. He sends the demons into the pigs, etc. And then the man asks to go with Jesus, and he says, no, go and tell your people what God in his mercy has done for you in the region of the Decapolis. So we're in the Decapolis. We're on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. This is one of the rare instances, in fact, the only instance in which Jesus leaves the boundaries of Israel in Matthew's Gospel. And he mutes it, He doesn't want to emphasize it. He's leaving out all of the details, but he has a very interesting detail that he adds. Look in verse 29. The two demoniacs, there's two of them. There's only one in Mark, but there's two. These Gentiles are pretty tough folk. So they shouted, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come to destroy us?" they say in Mark. In Matthew, they say, "Have you come to torment us before the time?" Okay. Before the time. Okay. This is in the Gentile territory. Jesus, the story of the Gadarenes, maybe it's so compelling to Matthew. It's part of the Markan sequence, but the demon knows the timing is wrong. You're not supposed to deal with us until you send the people to the nations. And it's a very interesting little addition, but I think it shows Matthew's consistency, that he really downplays the story. You don't have anything at the end about sending him out to the Decapolis. You don't get that mission sense yet. That only comes in Matthew with chapter 28, 16 to 20. So there's a sense here of these images of harbingers, that the healing, as the one commentator said, this is the then now. But the readers of the gospel are in the present now, and they're in the midst of the mission of healing. And we'll see that very clearly in the mission discourse, which speaks of experiences that could only have taken place after the resurrection of Christ, of the community's experience, but it's being given to the disciples in the past now, in the context of Jesus' story. And then we also have the rise of opposition to Jesus. This is the first in the gospel. Come chapter 11, it's going to come like a storm, okay, after the mission discourse. But here we have, in 9:3 there, this man is blaspheming, who has the power on earth to forgive sins, but God alone, And then, of course, their protest, the Pharisees' protest at the call of Matthew and eating with sinners. These will, explode in the gospel. beginning with chapter 11 and all the way through. We spend a whole session on this conflict. But here echoes. And this opposition, which Mark makes very clear in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, in his gospel, after this series of healings, it says the leaders went out and began a plot to destroy him. So Mark traces the first origin of the opposition of Jesus that leads to his death. And the basis for the opposition is the characteristic actions of Jesus: healing, association with outcasts, interpretation of the law, and a sense of mercy. And so Matthew, not as forcefully yet as Mark has done, but he also traces the origins of the opposition to Jesus on the very basis of the intrinsic character of his mission. This has become very important in today's theology, that to understand the meaning of the cross in the gospel literature, that if you sever the connection between the mission of Jesus and the death on the cross, you leave yourself open to a kind of atonement theology that is very deadly. That God decides arbitrarily to take the life of Jesus in order to satisfy divine anger or to pay for sin and so on. But if you connect it, as the Gospels do, with the mission of Jesus, the cross becomes the final expression of a series of commitments all along. He's there because of the way he lived. That's the way the Gospels present it. So that enables them to transform the meaning of the cross from a meaning of arbitrary, cruel death, which it had in Roman law, to totally discredit, delegitimize the person who's crucified. Why early Christianity could turn that around and make the cross a symbol of service, diakonia, come not to be served, but to serve, to give his life in ransom for the many, of no greater love than this, and one lay down one's life for one's friends. All of those powerful ascriptions of meaning to the cross for Christianity is based on the connection that the Gospels make with the mission of Jesus. The cross becomes the final expression of his mission, which changes its meaning fundamentally. So this little harbinger of it here is already significant, and we come to our conclusion here. It's just to say what is self-evident to you, but here it is in the gospel, driving it home to us that healing is an essential part of the mission of Jesus and of the mission of the community. We'll see that clearly next week when we look at the mission discourse. And healing is the embodiment of what Jesus has taught in the Sermon on the Mount. The same crowds that came to him, sick and in need, at chapter 4, 23 and following. If you remember, the very setting for the Sermon on the Mount, this was the same sick. And he teaches them that God's will is a will of love, reconciling, forgiving, healing, gratuitous love. Okay? That's the whole, the whole section there, 5:21 to 48, the love command in the manifold ways Jesus teaches it in the sermon. And here in this section, he embodies it in a healing touch. This is love in action. This is dealing with suffering. And this is a connection I think Christianity at its best has always made. This is the corporal works of mercy. But it's embodied. It's not just words, it's doing. We remember the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' emphasis on this. So it's the love command in action. This is not like one thing and then another. No, this is, there's an organic connection in the impact on the crowds for whom Jesus is moved with deep compassion, as the gospel says. And then again, all along as we've been moving and I think accelerating, the identity of Jesus. Matthew has a high Christology, if we can use that. And part of the ways it's expressed in what he does, his walking in the water, his healing, his forgiving sins, but it's also in the titles ascribed to him. And this was important for early Christology, taking titles that in many instances were traditional titles, used messianic titles, used of the king, used of great figures, the prophet, the servant, but now applied to Jesus by this gospel and literature and early Christian literature. But now those titles themselves are transformed by the person who bears them. So they're not, it's not like Jesus has to be trimmed to fit the title. The title is transformed to fit what the Christians understood who Jesus was. So, Son of David, an outright messianic title, very clearly so, Son of David the King, is used in the healing stories. It's mainly in the healing stories. Son of David, have mercy on me, have pity on me. The Son of Man, enigmatic saying, drawn from Ezekiel, most likely, not saying, but a title, having to do with both the humiliation of Jesus and his exaltation at the end of time. We will see this in the eschatological discourse. Son of God. We saw this already, the baptism. We're going to see it again in some of these texts, and it's probably the most exalted title in Matthew's gospel. Will be the final acclamation of the centurion at the cross, as it is at the transfiguration, and on the sea, the disciples will identify him as Son of God. Kyrie, Lord, used as it is in this story of the stilling of the storm, often in a sense of entreaty, prayer. Kyrie sozo me. We'll have Peter say that in chapter 14. Lord, save me. Lord, Kyrios, here's a title that's used in Greco-Roman context for the master, the leader, the one that's deferential. It's used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to translate Adonai, to translate the name for God, Kyrios. So it takes on, more than it means in the pervasive culture, it takes on a profound religious context because it's the word used to describe God himself. And Matthew uses it in conditions of extreme distress. People call out, Lord, Kyrie, save me. The bridegroom, as we saw in that little interlude there, about the bridegroom, he cannot fast when the bridegroom's here. And then the servant, applying to him the notion of the servant in chapter 8, verse 17, the fulfillment text takes away the burden of our infirmities and lifts away our sufferings. So Christology here, always, Matthew is communicating this strong sense of the authority and power of Jesus that underwrites and transforms all of this. Okay? So again, it's not like he's presenting him as a wonderful rabbi and teacher who eventually becomes, already for Matthew, in the past now and in the present now again, he is the divine figure. So this section of the gospel, sometimes I think it gets a little submerged because there's such focus on the Sermon on the Mount. But I think, anyone reading through it tentatively, we see how important this is for Matthew and for his understanding of the Christian mission. It's both, and both are related. The healing expresses the teaching, and the teaching gives words to the healing. So, Is everybody doing all right? You're hanging in there? So thank you all. Next week, we'll look at the syllabus. You'll see we're going to take up discipleship and mission. We'll look at the call stories that we've had, but we'll focus a lot on chapter 10, the mission discourse in Matthew and its follow-through in the rest of the gospel. So thank you all. Safe home. Watch out. It's supposed to snow tonight, right? 4 to 8 inches.